The cave had a reputation. Everyone along the Republican River country of Nebraska Territory knew about the Jacobson Cave. They knew about it the way frontier communities knew about the places where bad things had happened, not as a story told once and set aside, but as a piece of standing knowledge, the kind that got woven into practical advice. Don't camp near the Jacobson Cave. Don't shelter there in bad weather. Don't put your livestock in it. Lars Jacobson had been a Swedish homesteader who filed his claim in the spring of 1857, built a sod house on the upland, and spent the following winter in the cave on the bluff above his creek because his sod house roof collapsed under a December ice storm and he had nowhere else to go. He was a practical man, his neighbors said, a careful man, not given to panic or poor decisions. He had known about the cave since spring. He had gone into it in December with 2 blankets and a month's food and a pine knot torch, and he had not come out. His neighbors found him in March when the thaw made the creek crossing possible again. He was in the back of the cave, near the small fire ring he had built, sitting with his back against the wall in the position of a man who had lain down to rest and not risen. The fire was long out. The cave was cold. There was food remaining in his sack. He had not starved. The county physician who came from Red Cloud to examine him said there was no evident cause of death. He had not been injured. He had not frozen, because a man who freezes looks a particular way, and Lars Jacobson did not look that way. He had simply died in the cave in the way that sometimes people died on the frontier without an evident reason. The community buried him on his claim and noted the cave in the standing knowledge and moved on. That was the cave Astrid Leinonen stopped to look at on the 22nd of September 1859, carrying everything she owned on her back, walking south along the Republican River bluff toward nothing in particular. She was 41 years old. She had been cast out of the Leinonen claim 3 days before by her husband's brothers, Eino and Taavi, who had arrived from Michigan in August, and who had looked at the 160 acres of Nebraska Territory that Paavo Leinonen had spent 4 years turning from grassland into a working farm, and had made their calculation. The calculation was the same calculation that Thomas Greer had made, and Magnus Halvorsen had made, and Marta Brandt had made, the arithmetic of frontier survival that resolved a widow woman into a cost on one side of the ledger, and the land she was standing on into an asset on the other side. Eino and Taavi were not cruel men. They were men from Michigan who had been watching from a distance as their brother built something valuable and who had come to collect on the blood right they believed they possessed. Paavo had died in June of a twisted gut, the terrible quick kind, 4 days from the first pain to the last breath. He had not written a will, which was not unusual, because men who were 37 years old and strong and had 4 years of successful farming behind them did not think often about wills. He had left Astrid the claim and the 4 years of labor and the debt to the Red Cloud supply merchant for the spring seed. He had also left her, in a way he could not have known to count, the knowledge he did not know he was leaving. Paavo Leinonen had come from a Finnish family in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and his family's people before that from Savo province in Finland. And from Savo province there came a tradition of building and heating that was as old as the Finnish presence in the north, older than any house any of them had built on the frontier, the smoke sauna, the cuas, the principle of the heating stone. She had not thought of it for years. She had been building American houses with American methods since she arrived in Ohio in 1843, and the frontier had demanded the frontier's solutions, sod and timber and iron stoves, and the Finnish knowledge had sat in her like knowledge sits in a person who has not needed it yet, waiting without urgency. She stopped on the bluff above the Republican River in the September noon and looked down at the Jacobson Cave, and she thought about why Lars Jacobson had died. She had heard the story 4 times in 2 years, the physician's conclusion of no evident cause, the food remaining in the sack, the position he was found in, easy rather than distressed. She had filed the story the way she filed all information that did not yet have a use in the back of the mind where things waited. Standing on the bluff above the cave, with everything she owned on her back, and the first real cold of September in the air, and 10 weeks until the first hard frost, she took the story out of the back of her mind and looked at it. A man who died near a fire that had gone out, no injury, no starvation, not frozen, food remaining, sitting quietly. In Finland, there was a word for what happened to people in poorly ventilated spaces where fires had burned for a long time. The word did not translate well into English. The concept was simple. A fire consumed the air just as it consumed the wood, and in a space without adequate fresh air, the fire and the man competed for the same breath, and the fire won slowly, so slowly that a person became sleepy before they became aware of the danger, and the sleep was the last thing. Lars Jacobsen had not frozen and had not starved. He had gone to sleep in a cave where the fire had used the air, and he had not woken up. She stood on the bluff and looked at the cave opening below and thought about the air. She had been in enough Finnish smoke saunas in the Upper Peninsula to know that the smoke sauna that worked and the smoke sauna that killed were separated by one thing: the hole in the wall above the door, the ventilation gap, the place where the hot bad air left and the cold good air entered in the specific pattern that kept a person conscious and a fire burning for hours. Lars Jacobsen's cave would not have had a ventilation gap, because Lars Jacobsen had not known to build one, and because the cave was not his first choice of shelter, but his emergency one, and because a man in December emergency was thinking about warmth and not about the air that the fire would eat. She walked down the bluff path to the cave opening. The opening was roughly 6 feet wide and 4 feet high, in the face of the limestone bluff, partially concealed by a growth of wild plum that had seeded itself against the rock over the past 2 winters since anyone had been here. She pushed through the plum brush and stood at the cave mouth and looked in. The cave went back approximately 30 feet and was roughly oval in cross-section, widening to about 15 feet at its widest point before narrowing again toward the back. The ceiling height varied from 4 feet at the entrance to 7 feet at the center, dropping back to 5 feet at the rear wall. The floor was dry limestone and river clay, reasonably flat. The walls were pale grey limestone, streaked with the mineral deposits of centuries of water moving through them. In the center of the cave, toward the back, was Lars Jacobsen's fire ring, flat stones in a circle, blackened with old soot. Beside it, the remains of his wood supply, a dozen pieces of split oak, now 2.5 years dry. Near the back wall, his blankets, folded still because he had not reached them. She stepped inside and stood in the center of the cave and turned slowly. She was looking for 2 things. The first was the natural air movement, the draft that would tell her whether the cave had any natural ventilation. She wet her finger and held it up. Nothing. The air in the cave was perfectly still. The second was the rock itself. She pressed her hand to the north wall at the back of the cave, the deepest point, the rock farthest from the entrance. The limestone was cool, not cold. The ground temperature of Nebraska Territory at this latitude ran approximately 52 to 54 degrees below the frost line. The same as Illinois, the same as Kansas, the same as any deep earth anywhere on this part of the continent. The rock was 52 degrees, and it had been 52 degrees since before Lars Jacobsen arrived, and it would be 52 degrees after all of them were gone. She pressed her hand to the east wall, then the west wall, then the ceiling at the high point. The ceiling was the most interesting surface. The natural vault of the limestone above the cave center was the shape of a dome, or close to it, and the dome's highest point was perhaps 8 feet from the floor. In a Finnish smoke sauna, the heat and the bad air went up and the good air stayed low. In a properly built QS arrangement, the smoke and the carbon products of the fire rose to the ceiling and were expelled through the vent, while the breathing air at floor level stayed clean. The Jacobson cave had no vent. The bad air from his fire had risen to the ceiling, accumulated there with nowhere to go, and eventually displaced enough of the breathing air below that he had gone to sleep before he understood what was happening. She could put a vent in the ceiling. She stood in the cave for a full hour. She moved around it, pressing walls, checking the floor for moisture seep, looking at the way the natural rock formed the space. The cave had a crack in the rear upper wall. She could see it when she held her lamp close, a natural fracture running up through the limestone from approximately 4 feet off the floor. Not a crack all the way through, not daylight at the end of it, but a fracture that ran upward into the rock for a distance she could not determine without tools. She stepped back outside and climbed the bluff face to the point above the cave. She walked the surface of the rock, looking for the fracture on the outside. It took 20 minutes to find it, because the grass and the lichen had grown over the surface. But it was there, a line in the rock running east to west across the bluff face, a geological fault that had been slowly opening for centuries, currently approximately 1 inch wide at the surface. She pressed her face to the crack and smelled. The smell from the crack was the smell of the cave below, of limestone and old clay and the faint mineral residue of Lars Jacobson's firing. The crack went all the way through. She stood up on the bluff face and looked south along the Republican River Valley, and looked north back toward the Leinonen claim, and looked at the position of the sun in the September sky. The cave faced south-southwest. The bluff it was, faced into the prevailing winter wind from the northwest, which meant the entrance in winter would be sheltered from the direct wind by the bluff face running above it and by the wild plum growth at the entrance. The cave was below grade from the bluff surface by approximately 12 feet. The crack in the ceiling was directly above the cave center. She went back down to the cave entrance and sat down on the limestone ledge at the mouth. She had the tools from the Leinonen farm, as many as she could carry: the cold chisel and the hammer, the hand drill and 2 bits, the draw knife, the hatchet, the trowel, the long rope coil. She had the supplies she had taken from the Leinonen smokehouse when Aino told her she could have whatever she could carry: a side of cured pork, 4 pounds of dried beans, 3 pounds of cornmeal, half a pound of coffee. She had her husband's wool coat, which was too large for her and exactly right for the purposes she intended. She had $22 in cash, which was all that remained of the household savings after the spring seed debt, and which she had counted and put in her dress pocket and carried without telling Aino it was there. She had 10 weeks before the hard frost. She had what she had. She went to work. The first task was the ventilation shaft. Without it, everything else she built was another Lars Jacobson situation, a warm space that would kill her. She spent the first 3 days entirely on the shaft, working from above with the hand drill and the cold chisel, widening the natural crack in the limestone from 1 inch to 4 inches across, and clearing the loose material from inside it. She worked on hands and knees on the bluff surface, her head over the crack, the chisel going down into the rock at the angle the fracture provided, the rubble coming up in a tin bucket she had brought from the claim. 4 inches was enough. 4 inches of natural draft in a limestone crack, properly positioned at the high point of a cave ceiling vault, would draw the hot gases from a fire upward and out, while the cold, fresh air entered from the cave mouth below. The principle was the same as a chimney. Hot air rises, cold air follows it, and the fire in between consumed neither the man nor all his air as long as the system moved. She tested the draft on the evening of the 3rd day. She lit a piece of dry grass held at the cave floor near the fire ring and watched the smoke. It rose, as smoke always rose, toward the ceiling vault. At the ceiling, it moved in the specific direction of the crack, the slight negative pressure of the crack drawing the hot gases through. She pressed her face near the cave floor and breathed. The air near the floor was cool and clean, carrying the smell of the October prairie. No smoke, no carbon products. The bad air was going up and out through the crack. The good air was coming in from the cave entrance and running along the floor. She sat back on her heels. Lars Jacobsen had died for want of a 4-inch hole in the ceiling. She went outside and looked up at the bluff face where the crack emerged and watched the first real smoke of her first test fire come out of it, thin and pale against the grey limestone, the exact behaviour of a properly drawing chimney. She went back inside and built the fire up and stood in the cave for 2 hours, working on the floor levelling while the fire burned, and at the end of 2 hours she blew out the fire and assessed the air. Clean. The cave smelled of smoke and limestone, but the air was breathable, the specific quality of air that had been moving rather than sitting. She was not going to die the way Lars Jacobsen died. The second problem was the floor. The Republican River clay was not a flat floor surface by nature. It was a clay surface that had been slowly deposited over centuries in a pattern of slightly higher ground in the center and lower ground at the edges, forming a gentle dish shape that was not apparent to the eye but was apparent to a bucket of water. The dish shape would pool water from any seep or condensation at the walls and hold it. She needed the water to move out, not pool in. She spent 2 days on the floor reversing the dish. She used the hatchet to break the high center points down and the excavated material to build up the edges, creating a very slight outward slope from center to entrance, a 2-inch fall across the 15-foot width of the cave. Not steep enough to notice with the eye, sufficient for water to move toward the entrance rather than sitting. She packed the revised floor with the heel of her boot in overlapping strikes across the whole surface until it was as hard as the limestone it was sitting on, and then she was done with the floor. The walls she addressed next, not because the walls needed structural work, but because she was planning to use them differently than Lars Jacobsen had used them. She was Finnish. She was building a Kuas. A Finnish Kuas was the heating stone system of the smoke sauna, the principle that had kept Finnish people alive through centuries of winters that would have dismayed the most determined American frontiersmen. The Kuas was not a fireplace, and it was not a brazier. It was a collection of dense, fire-resistant rocks stacked above a firebox, arranged to absorb the heat of the fire and hold it in a mass so large that the heat dissipated over many hours rather than minutes. A well-built Kuas, heated with one large fire, could hold the heat for 12 hours. In a properly enclosed stone sauna in Finland, that 12 hours of radiated heat kept the space at 60 to 80 degrees through the night and into the morning. She was not building a sauna. She was building a cave home. The Kuas principle was the same. She needed specific stones, not any stones. Dense, crystalline stones with low porosity and high specific heat capacity, the kind that absorbed heat readily and gave it back slowly. In Finland, these were specific granite types from specific quarries, known by the people who used them for how they behaved in the fire. On the Republican River bluffs of Nebraska Territory, she needed to find the equivalent. She spent one afternoon on the creek bed, turning stones, weighing them in her hand, breaking a sample from each candidate type with the hammer and looking at the grain. What she was looking for, though she did not have the mineralogy vocabulary for it, was dense, fine-grained stone with minimal visible pore structure, the kind of stone that rang like iron when you struck it rather than thudding like sandstone. The Republican River bluffs produced, along their base, where the limestone gave way to older formations, pieces of a dark grey stone that she thought might be quartzite, a stone she recognized from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where the Finnish community had used it for Kuas stones because it did not fracture when heated. She collected 40 pounds of it in 2 trips, carrying it in the rope bundle on her back. The Kuas she built in the center rear of the cave, below the ventilation crack, used these quartzite stones as the heat mass. The firebox she constructed of flat limestone pieces on edge, a firebox 18 inches square and 12 inches deep, set directly on the clay floor. Above the firebox, in the space where the fire's heat would rise, she stacked the quartzite stones in a pyramid, open enough for the heat to circulate through, but dense enough to absorb it. The stone mass above the firebox was approximately 200 pounds of quartzite, stacked to a height of 2 feet. The firebox had air intakes at the bottom front, gaps between the floor-course limestone pieces wide enough for air to enter and feed the fire, but positioned to create a draft upward through the firebox and up into the stone mass. The system would work the same way the ventilation shaft worked. Air entered from below, heat rose through the stones and up through the cave ceiling crack. She tested the cures on the 15th day of October. She built a large fire in the firebox, the largest she had yet made, burning 4 good pieces of the hardwood she had gathered from the creek bottom over the previous week. She fed the fire for 3 hours, maintaining it at full burn, feeding it steadily, watching the quartzite stones above the firebox change color as they absorbed the heat. The stones did not turn red the way iron turned red. They absorbed heat invisibly, storing it in their crystal structure, becoming hotter than they appeared. After 3 hours, she extinguished the fire and sealed the firebox air intakes with flat stones. Then she went to the cave entrance and sat down and waited. The quartzite stones radiated their stored heat into the cave air for 6 hours before she could no longer feel the warmth on her hands from across the cave. The cave temperature, which had been 52 degrees before she started, peaked at 68 degrees and was still 58 degrees at the end of the 6 hours. She was in her wool husband's coat in the cave with no fire burning. In mid-October in Nebraska Territory, at 58 degrees at midnight, and the outside temperature was 26. She sat against the east wall in the cave, dark, and felt the warmth coming off the stone pyramid across the cave from her, and thought about her husband Paavo, who had been a practical man and a kind one, who had carried his family's Finnish knowledge in his blood and his hands, without perhaps understanding how he would have applied it on the frontier, who had died before he could, and who had left her alone to find out what she knew. She pressed her palm flat on the cave floor, which was 54 degrees from the hill's own heart, and thought, "Paavo, this is what your people knew, this is what I know now." She let the feeling be there for a moment, and then she got up and went back to work. October. The cave entrance needed a door. Not for warmth primarily, because the natural overhang of the bluff above the cave mouth provided wind protection, and the wild plum brush at the entrance absorbed the worst of the northwest wind's force. She needed the door for privacy, and for control over the air column, the ability to regulate how much cold outside air was entering the cave and at what rate, balancing the ventilation against the heat retention. She built the door from timber salvaged from the creek bottom, 2 trees that had fallen against the bank in the summer floods and dried through the autumn, straight-grained cottonwood that split cleanly under the hatchet. She split the planks, edge-joined them with wooden pegs she cut herself, and hung the door in a timber frame she set in the cave mouth, using the cold chisel to cut the socket holes in the limestone. The door did not have glass. She did not have glass, and she did not have money to spare for it. It had 2 small openings at eye level and waist level, each fitted with a wooden cover on a leather hinge. The upper opening, when she opened it, admitted light and air. The lower opening, when she opened it, admitted the cold, fresh air that would feed the ventilation system during and after a fire. The door was hung on rope hinges, not iron, because she had no iron to spare. She had used her iron nails for structural joints in the Cure's firebox. The rope hinges were twisted rawhide from the deer she had snared in the 2nd week, the same deer that had provided her first substantial meal since leaving the Leinonen claim. She was not skilled with snares. Paavo had been the hunter in the family. She had watched him set them and had helped maintain them, and she knew the principle, but her first week of snaring had produced nothing. The 2nd week, She found the rabbit runs along the creek bank and moved her wire loops to the right positions and began catching every third day. She went to Red Cloud in the second week of October. Red Cloud was the nearest settlement of size, a day's walk south along the Republican River, with a post office and a general store and a physician and the sort of commercial and social infrastructure that a town acquired when it had been in place long enough to develop opinions about things. She went for supplies and for information. She bought salt at the Red Cloud General Store, 3 pounds and a roll of oilcloth and a ball of strong twine. She spent $4.20 and kept the rest. At the store, she listened to the talk, which was the frontier talk of late October, wood supplies and weather signs, and the condition of the creek crossings, and who had come through from the east recently. She heard the name Halverson mentioned in connection with a claim dispute to the north, which had nothing to do with her. She heard the name Mecklenburg mentioned in connection with a family that had given up and gone back to Illinois in September, leaving a claim and a half-built cabin on the creek west of town. She walked west to the Mecklenburg claim on her way back. The half-built cabin was exactly as described. A timber frame with 3 walls and no roof, the 4th wall studs standing but not boarded. The intended roof structure partially framed and then abandoned when the Mecklenburgs decided in September that they had started too late and had too little capital to finish before winter. The timber was good, green still, not yet fully dried, but usable for her purposes, which did not require seasoned wood. She spent 4 hours at the Mecklenburg claim with the hatchet taking what she needed. She took the window frame, unglazed but properly sized, and 4 of the shorter roof timbers and a piece of board already fitted with iron hardware from the door frame. She did not take more than she could use. She left the standing timber and the framing intact. She carried what she had taken back to the cave in 2 loads, walking the 4 miles each way in the October dark on the second trip, arriving at the cave entrance at 11 at night with the load on her back and the creek running 30 feet below under a half moon. She lit the small lamp she had made from a tin cup and a twist of tallow wick, and went inside and stacked her materials, and sat down by the Kiowa stone mass and pressed her hand to the quartzite. The stones were warm. She had fired the Kiowas that morning before she left, a moderate fire of 2 hours, and the stones had been radiating since noon. It was nearly midnight, and the stones were still warm to the touch, still giving back the morning's fire. She stayed up for another hour checking the Kiowas mortar joints and filling the gaps she found with fresh clay. Then she slept on the sleeping platform she had built from creek timber against the east wall. November arrived. The routine settled into itself the way routine settled on the frontier, not by decision, but by the shape of what needed doing and the time available to do it. She fired the Kiowas every 2 days when the weather was cold, once a day when it dropped below 15 degrees. Each firing was a 2-hour fire, not a continuous burn, because the Kiowa stones stored more heat from a hot, intense fire than from a long, slow one, and 2 hours of full burn was enough to charge the stone mass for 12 to 14 hours of radiated warmth. She burned approximately 1 cord of wood per month. She cut it from the creek bottom in the mornings, 3 mornings a week, hauling what she could carry up the bluff path to the cave. The Republican River Creek bottom had fallen hardwood in quantity, cottonwood and ash, and the occasional elm, the deadfall of previous seasons. She did not cut standing timber because standing timber was harder to cut and wetter, and because there was enough fallen wood for the winter if she was systematic. The cave temperature before morning firing ran between 50 and 55 degrees, the Earth's own gift. After firing, it ran between 64 and 70 degrees for the 12 hours following the fire. She was warm. She was not comfortable in the way of a person in an established home. She was warm, which was the thing that mattered. She went to see Elsa Brandt in November. Elsa Brandt was a widow herself, 60 years old, who had been on her claim 3 miles north along the bluff for 11 years, farming with her son and his family. She was known in the Republican River country as a woman who knew things, the specific kind of knowing that came from 11 years of paying attention to land that had been trying to tell you things and finally learning to listen. She knew the weather signs, she knew the creek behavior, she knew the winter food habits of the game along the bluff. She had outlasted more settlers than she could count. Astrid went to Elsa because she needed someone in the valley to know where she was, and because she wanted to know what the winter was likely to be. Elsa was in her sod house kitchen when Astrid knocked. She looked at Astrid for a moment and then let her in and put coffee on and sat across the table and listened to the whole story from Paavo's death in June, through Eino and Taavi's arrival, and through the cave and the ventilation shaft and the Kuus. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "The Jacobson Cave." Astrid said, "Yes." Elsa said, "Everyone around here knows that cave." Astrid said, "I know." Elsa said, "Jacobson died in there." Astrid said, "He died because the fire used the air and he didn't know to put a hole in the ceiling." She explained the ventilation. Elsa listened. Elsa said, "A hole in the ceiling." Astrid said, "The bad air goes out and the fresh air comes in. As long as the air moves, the fire and the person can share the cave." Elsa put both hands around her coffee cup and looked at Astrid for a long time, with the assessing look of a woman who had been watching people make decisions in hard country for 11 years. She said, "And you're warm in there." Astrid said, "Warm enough." Elsa said, "It's November, and you're warm enough in the Jacobson Cave." Astrid said, "It's the stone, the Finnish heating stone system. A large mass of the right stone absorbs the fire's heat and gives it back slowly. I heat the stone for 2 hours, and it warms the cave for 12. Elsa thought about this. She said, "Like a night storage stove." Astrid said, "I don't know that term." Elsa said, "My parents had one. Big block of soapstone in the corner of the kitchen. You heated it once a day, and it kept the kitchen warm all night." She was quiet. German thing. She was German. She paused. "And the cave itself holds heat?" Astrid said. "The rock is 52 degrees before I ever light a fire. That's free heat. I'm starting from 52, and I only need to close the gap from 52 to 65, not from 10 to 65. Elsa looked out her kitchen window at the November Creek Valley. She said, "I burned 4 cord of wood last November." Astrid said, "1 cord this month, maybe less." Elsa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need?" Astrid said, "I need someone in this valley who knows I'm in that cave. If something happens." Elsa said, "I know you're in that cave." Astrid said, "I may need a physician if I get sick." Elsa said, "I know Dr. Halverson in Red Cloud." Astrid said, "And there are 2 Finnish families on the Loop River drainage, northeast of here, the Mäkinen family and the Irjana family. If anything happened to me, I would want them to know." Elsa wrote the names in the small account book she kept for the things that mattered. She said, "You have no family closer than the Loop River?" Astrid said, "My husband's brothers are in Michigan. There are no others." Elsa said, "And Eino and Taavi." Astrid said, "Are in Michigan now, I believe." Elsa looked at her. She said, "What are you going to do about the claim?" Astrid said, "The claim was filed in Paavo's name alone. He came here before me. He filed it before the marriage was recorded in the territory." She said this without bitterness, as information. "It is Eino and Taavi's claim." Elsa said, "And they know where you are?" Astrid said, "I left a note at the sod house saying I had found shelter." Elsa was quiet. Then she said, "I think you should file a claim on the cave land." Astrid looked at her. Elsa said, "The Jacobson claim lapsed when Lars died, and no heir filed. The cave is on Jacobson's land, which is unimproved and unclaimed. You have been occupying and improving it since September." She paused. "I think you have a preemption case if you file before the spring survey." Astrid said, I didn't know the Jacobson claim had lapsed. Elsa said, I've been watching it for 2 years, waiting for someone to do something sensible with that land. She paused. Lars was a good man. He built his sod house on the upland, which is the good ground. He died in the cave, which is the good shelter. He just didn't know what you know. Astrid sat across from Elsa Brandt in the sod house kitchen in November and thought about a Swedish man who had not known to put a hole in the ceiling, and about a Finnish man who had died of a twisted gut without writing a will, and about how the knowledge that could have saved them both had been in one or another set of hands all along, but had not been in the right hands at the right moment. She said, How do I file a preemption claim? Elsa said, You go to the Red Cloud Land Office in the spring with evidence of improvement and occupation. She paused. The cave improvements will count. The door, the floor work, the ventilation system. You may need a witness who can attest to your occupation since September. Astrid said, Would you witness? Elsa said, Yes. She filed the preemption claim in April of 1860. But that was after the winter. That was after what the winter brought, December. The Republicans' River Valley, in Nebraska Territory, in the winter of 1859 to 1860, was not the worst winter anyone in the region could remember, but it was not mild. The temperature dropped to -12 in the second week of December and held there for 6 days, then rose briefly into the single digits above zero before dropping again. There was snow in the first week of December, 6 inches, followed by a clear cold spell, followed by more snow, the pattern of a winter that was building rather than spending itself. She was warm. This is the central fact of the December record she kept in the small notebook she had brought from the Leinonen claim, and it is what she wrote each morning after checking the temperature and the Kua stone mass. Warm enough, or warm, or adequately warm, depending on how cold it had been in the night. She was not only warm, she was busy. She had the snare line on the creek and the wood cutting and the Kua's management and the small maintenance tasks that a stone and clay structure required in cold weather. She had the journal she had been keeping since Paavo's death, in Finnish, which was the language she thought in when she was not performing her thinking for anyone else. She had the English grammar she had bought at the Red Cloud General Store in October, the cheapest book they had, which she was working through in the evenings after the Kuas was fired and the day's work was done. She had, on certain evenings, the particular quality of solitude that was not loneliness but was its adjacent country, the silence of a person alone in a small, warm space with the winter outside, close enough to the edge of survivability to know exactly what warm meant. She kept track of the wood consumption. In the first week of December, before the serious cold arrived, she had used 7 pieces of split hardwood, approximately a quarter cord. In the second week, when the temperature dropped to -12, she had used 14 pieces, firing the Kuas every day rather than every other day, running the fire for 3 hours rather than 2 on the coldest days. A timber frame house in this climate was burning through 2 cord per week in -12 weather, feeding a box stove that could not keep the bedroom above 38 degrees. Her neighbor to the east, a family named Thorvaldsen, had a good sod house and were burning a cord a week. She was burning a cord a month in a cave, warmer than either of them. She did not say this to anyone. She went to Elsa's for Christmas dinner, and she went to the Red Cloud General Store twice in December for supplies, and she said, when asked, that she was managing well, which was true and which was what she said. The Thorvaldsen family visited once in December, the husband Gunnar and his wife Berit, and their 3 children. They had heard about the cave from Elsa and had come, Berit said honestly, because she was curious and because their house was cold, and she wanted to understand something that Elsa had described. Berit came in and stood in the center of the cave and held her hands out toward the Kuas stone mass and felt the warmth radiating from the quartzite. Warm hours after the fire had been out. She was 32 years old, and she had been on the Nebraska frontier for 4 years, and she had never been genuinely warm in winter, the specific warmth of a room that held its temperature through the night and was still warm in the morning. She said, "Those are stones." Astrid said, "Finish heating stones, the quartzite from the bluff base. You heat them with a large fire for 2 hours, and they radiate the heat for 12. Berit said, 12 hours. Astrid said, more if the fire is good. Berit looked at the stones. She looked at the ventilation crack in the ceiling, which Astrid explained. She looked at the cave walls and the door and the sleeping platform. She pressed her hand to the north wall at the back of the cave, the deep limestone. She said, "It's warm." Astrid said, 53 degrees when I came back in from the cold this morning before I lit the fire. Berit said, "The rock is 53 degrees in December." Astrid said, "The rock is 53 degrees in July also. It does not change. The sky changes, the rock does not." Berit was quiet for a long time. She looked at the quartzite stone pyramid above the firebox, and then at the ceiling crack, and then at the cave walls. She said, "My children have been sleeping in their coats." Astrid said nothing. Berit said, "Gunnar says the house is adequate." Astrid said, "The house may be adequate for Gunnar." Berit looked at her. Then she did something that surprised Astrid, which was to sit down on the cave floor, cross-legged, and put her hands flat on the clay surface and feel the warmth coming up from the earth below. She sat there for a while. She said, "I want to learn how to build this." Astrid said, "Not the cave. You don't have a cave, but you have a south-facing hillside on your claim." Berit said, "The east side of the creek bluff." Astrid said, "I saw it when I came through your property in October. 8 feet of limestone showing. If you cut into it 4 feet and build a stone-faced front wall, you can have this. Not the cave exactly. The same principle." Berit said, "Gunnar won't." Astrid said, "Will Gunnar's children sleep warm?" Berit was quiet. Astrid said, "In the spring, I will help you. We can do in 2 weeks what took me 6, because you will know what you are building before you start." She had not planned to say this. She had been alone since September, and she had been managing alone, and the solitude had its virtues, the specific virtue of a person who did not have to manage anyone's expectations but her own. But she looked at Berit Thorvaldsen sitting on the cave floor with her hands pressed to the warm earth, and she thought about the knowledge in her hands and what it was for. January came. The blizzard came on January 9th. Astrid knew it was coming 2 days before it arrived. She knew it the way her father had known weather in Finland, by a combination of signs that were individually small and collectively unambiguous. The way the creek surface froze suddenly in a period that had been above freezing, the behavior of the rabbits on the snare line moving to lower ground in the daytime rather than their normal late afternoon pattern, the quality of the northwest wind on January 7th, a dryness and a particular pressure that the regular winter wind did not have. She had felt this quality of wind once before, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the winter of 1851, 2 days before a blizzard that had killed 14 people along the Lake Superior shore. On January 7th, she spent the full day cutting firewood. She cut everything on the creek bottom within a quarter mile that was accessible and dry enough to burn. She cut in the morning before breakfast and through the midday and into the afternoon until the light failed. She made 11 trips up the bluff path with the rope bundle on her back, and she stacked the wood against the cave's east wall to the ceiling. 11 trips. She was 41 years old, and she had been doing physical work for 4 months. And she was stronger than she had been when she left the Leinonen claim, and she was very tired by the evening of January 7th. She fired the Kewers that night with the largest fire she had built since October. 3 hours of full burn, feeding it with the best hardwood pieces she had, the dense ash rounds that she had been saving for the coldest nights. She packed the firebox air intakes closed when the fire burned down and went to sleep on the sleeping platform at 68 degrees in the cave. January 8th was the last calm day. She spent it checking the door frame and filling the gaps in the frame with clay and laying in the last of the oilcloth strips she had been using to seal the upper door openings against wind infiltration. She moved all her food supplies from the ledge shelf to a box she positioned beside the sleeping platform, close and accessible. She filled the water bucket at the creek and brought it inside and filled the clay pot as well, because once the blizzard came, she would not be going to the creek. She was ready when it arrived. The blizzard reached the Republican River Valley on the morning of January 9th at approximately 10 in the morning. She heard it first as a change in the sound of the wind outside the cave door, the ordinary winter wind sound shifting into something harder and higher, the voice of a storm that was not a storm among other weathers, but was weather itself, total and final for whatever duration it chose. She was inside with the door shut and the cuers charged, and the food and water within reach, and the wood stacked along the east wall. The storm drove snow horizontally for 7 hours. She tracked its progress by sound, the roar of the wind against the bluff face above, which varied as gusts peaked and eased, the creaking of the cave door in its frame, the rope hinges holding, the quality of the cold air seeping through the lower door opening, which she had left slightly open to maintain the ventilation air supply. The ventilation air entering from the lower door opening was cold, perhaps minus 25 to 30 degrees outside. Inside the cave, the temperature dropped from 63 degrees when the storm started to 57 degrees at noon and 54 degrees at 4 in the afternoon as the cold infiltrated through the door gaps and the cuer stones worked through their stored heat. At 4 in the afternoon, she relit the cuers. She had not planned to fire it twice in one day. She had planned to let the original charge carry through and fire again tomorrow morning. But the temperature curve told her that the afternoon was going to continue dropping if she did not add heat, and 54 degrees was the floor, the Earth's gift, below which the cave did not go, but 54 degrees in a blizzard with a door that was not perfectly sealed was colder than 54 degrees felt in September. She fired the cuers for 2 hours, and the cave temperature came back to 62 and held there. The knock came at 7 in the evening. She was not expecting it. The blizzard was still running. She could hear it through the limestone above her, less violent than the morning, but still a serious thing. Minus 25 at least outside, and the snow still driving. 3 knocks on the cave door. A pause. 3 more. She put on the wool coat and went to the door and said, through the gap, "Who is there?" A voice she did not recognize said, "Thorvaldsen. Gunnar Thorvaldsen, please." She said, "How many?" The voice said, 5, my family, and 2 more. She said, "Give me a moment." She pulled the cuers open and added 3 pieces of wood, the largest she had, because there were going to be 7 people in the cave, and they were going to be cold when they arrived, and she needed the fire before they came in, not after. She moved the sleeping platform supplies to make room on the floor. She moved the water bucket closer to the fire position. Then she opened the door. Gunnar Thorvaldsen came in first, carrying his youngest child, a girl of 2 years, bundled in every piece of clothing they owned. The child was not moving. She was breathing. She was white at the lips, and her color was wrong in the way that a person's color was wrong when the cold had been working on them for too long. Behind Gunnar came Berit with the 2 older children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, both conscious, both moving, both making the small sounds of extreme cold working itself out of a body. Behind Berit came 2 people Astrid did not recognize, a man and a woman older, perhaps 60, wrapped in anything they had been able to grab. Last through the door was a face she had not expected. Aino Leinonen. He was alone. He was wearing the heavy wool coat she had seen him wearing in September when he came from Michigan to take the Leinonen claim. He had frost on his beard, and his hands were shaking, and he was moving with the careful, deliberate motion of a man who was operating on the last of his functional warmth. He stepped through the door into the cave and stopped. He looked at the Cure stones glowing with heat. He looked at the cave walls and the ceiling and the door she had hung, and the wood stacked along the east wall and the clay floor and the ventilation crack above him. He looked at Astrid. He said her name. She said, "Sit down, Aino." He sat down on the cave floor. He was shaking. She moved to the child first. The 2-year-old girl, whose name she did not yet know, she took from Gunnar's arms and carried to the Cure stone mass and crouched with the child's body facing the radiating heat, not close enough to burn, close enough to begin the warming, holding the child's feet toward the warmth and watching the color come back. The child's name, she learned in the next hour, was Marta. She was Gunnar and Berit's youngest, 26 months old, who had been asleep in the family bed when the sod house roof cracked under the snow load at 4 in the afternoon, and the whole family had run for the nearest shelter, which was not the nearest shelter, because they had forgotten in the panic of the collapsing roof that there was a cave 3 miles away that was open to them. They had run toward the Red Cloud Road, which was a mistake, because the Red Cloud Road was exposed to the full force of the northwest wind, and they had been in the open in -25-degree temperatures and blizzard wind for 2 hours before they found the bluff path by accident in the dark and followed it to the cave. 2 hours in -25 with blizzard wind. The 2 older children had been moving under their own power when they arrived, and were recovering quickly in the cave warmth, color returning, their trembling slowing as the heat from the Cure stones reached them. Berit was exhausted and cold, but functional. Gunnar was functional and grim in the way of a man who had been responsible for something that had almost gone very wrong. The older couple, whose name was Hedelston, had been in their timber-frame house a half-mile from the Thorvaldsen claim when their stovepipe joint failed in the storm, sending smoke back into the house. They had gone outside to check the pipe, and the wind had taken the decision to go back inside from them, and they had walked in the direction of shelter until Gunnar found them and brought them with him. Marta, the 2-year-old, was the most serious case. Her lips came back to their normal color in 40 minutes. Her hands, which had been cold to the bone when Astrid took her, warmed slowly over an hour, the blood returning to the fingers in the particular painful way it returned to extremities that had been cold. She cried when this happened, which was the best sound she could make, which was proof that the nerves were working and the tissue had not been permanently damaged. Berit Thorvaldsen sat on the cave floor with her daughter in her lap as the color came back and said nothing for a long time. She did not cry. She had been running in a blizzard for 2 hours with a 2-year-old, and she was past the kind of crying that needed an immediate occasion. What she was still, with a quality of stillness that was also a kind of reckoning. The cave held 60 degrees, with 7 adults, and 1 small child in it for the whole of that long night. 60 degrees from the Cure stones radiating and the cave walls holding what they always held, and the 7 bodies adding their own heat to the enclosed space. She fired the Kiowas again at midnight, a 2-hour fire that brought the temperature back to 67 and let it burn down to coals and then die. Aino sat against the west wall through most of the night and said little. He was thawed and functional by 9 in the evening, and he ate the cornmeal porridge she made for everyone on the trivet stone beside the Kiowas, and he drank coffee, and he looked at the cave. At midnight, when the older children were asleep on the sleeping platform, and the Hedelstons were dozing against the south wall, and Berit had fallen asleep with Marta on her lap, Aino sat awake across from Astrid in the Cure's glow. He said, "I have been in Red Cloud for 3 weeks. I came back to look at the claim." She said, "There is nothing wrong with the claim." He said, "Ta'avi wants to sell it. We disagree on this." She said nothing. He said, "I thought I might find you in Red Cloud when I came through." He paused. I asked at the land office if you had filed anything. She said, I filed a preemption on the Jacobson land in October. The cave is on the Jacobson claim. He was quiet. He said, the land office clerk told me about the filing. He told me you were living in the cave. She said, yes. He said, and I came out this afternoon to find the cave because I wanted to see it. He looked at the Cure stones. He said, the road was passable in the afternoon. Then the storm came harder. She said, yes. He said, I came up the bluff path and I found the cave, and I had the cave door between me and the blizzard, and I knocked. She said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, and the Thorvaldsens. She said, they found the path after I had already let you in. He said, their roof went. She said, yes. He looked at the child, Marta, sleeping on her mother's lap on the cave floor in the Cure's warmth. He said, that child was very cold when they came in. She said, yes, she's warm now. He said, you warmed her. She said, the cave warmed her. I held her toward the stones. He was quiet for a while. He was a man who could do arithmetic, and he was doing it. She had been living in this cave since September. She had built the ventilation system that had made it livable, and the Cure's heating system that kept it warm, and the door that made it weathertight. She had been in this cave for 4 months alone, and she had been warm, and she had tonight kept 7 people alive through a blizzard that had taken the roof off the Thorvaldsen house and driven an older couple into the open in -25 weather. He said, Ta'avi wants to sell the Leinonen claim. She said, that is between you and Ta'avi. He said, if we sold it, you would not have the land to farm. She said, I filed on the Jacobson land. I have the cave land. He looked at the cave. He said, you intend to stay here? She said, yes. He said, in the cave. She said, in the cave and the structure I intend to build in front of it when the spring comes. Stone walls and a timber roof facing south. I have the materials. He said, alone. She said, Berit Thorvaldsen is going to help me build, and there are Finnish families on the Lut River who know about the Cure system. He was quiet for a long time. The Cure stones were cooling now, the fire having been out for 2 hours, but the cave held 62 degrees and would hold it until morning from the mass of the stones and the mass of the hill and the 7 warm bodies. He said, Paavo. She waited. He said, Paavo was the best of us. He was better than Tavi and better than me. He built something good here. She said, yes. He said, and then he died and we came and took it from you. She said nothing. He said, I am not going to say it was not wrong, because it was wrong. I'm going to tell you what I would like to do now, which is that when Ta'avi wants to sell the claim, I'm going to buy him out, and I'm going to tell him to go back to Michigan without taking any more from this valley. She said, what will you do with a Nebraska claim? He said, Ta'avi's share of the original filing is 40 acres of timber on the West Creek. I will buy that from him, and I will keep it. He paused. I have a wife in Michigan. She has wanted to come west for 3 years. He was quiet again. I think she would like to know you. Astrid looked at the cave walls in the Cure's glow. She thought about what to say and found that there was not much to say that was not contained in what had already happened in the past 6 months, in what the cave and the stone system had already answered. She said, in the spring, come see what I build. Bring your wife. He said, yes. The blizzard broke at 4 in the morning. The wind died in stages, and by 6 there was no wind at all, only the deep cold that sat after a blizzard, and the particular brittle clarity of the sky that followed violence, cloudless and hard and very cold. The Heddlestons left at first light, their stovepipe they could fix when they reached their house. Gunnar Thorvaldsen left an hour later to check on the sod house ruins, walking through 3 feet of new snow, and came back an hour after that with the report that the roof was gone entirely, and everything in the house that had been below the roof when it fell was under the snow and the ruins. He stood in the cave entrance and looked at his wife, who was sitting against the south wall with Marta asleep in her lap, both of them warm, both of them having survived the night in the cave. He said, "The house is finished." Berit said, "I know." He said, "We'll need to stay somewhere until I can build again." She looked at Astrid. Astrid said, "You can stay here as long as you need." Gunnar looked at the cave, at the Kiowa stones, at the stone walls and the door and the clay floor and the ventilation crack in the ceiling and all the things his wife had seen in December and understood and tried to explain to him. He said, "I want to learn how this works." Astrid said, "I know." Gunnar said, "I didn't listen in December." She said, "No." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The child." She said, "She's warm now?" He said, "Yes." He looked at the Kiowa stones. He said, "How do you build one of those?" She said, "Sit down, I'll explain." He sat down on the clay floor in the cave that the whole Republican River Valley called the cave where Lars Jakobsen had died, and Astrid Leinonen explained the Kiowa's heating stone system to him in the plain language she had used for everything she built since September, starting with what was true and building from there. If this story made you think differently about what the right knowledge in the right moment is worth, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from. And I want to know this. Has there been a moment in your life where something you learned from a parent or from the old country, something you carried for years without knowing when you would need it, suddenly turned out to be exactly what the situation required? Because what Astrid Leinonen built in the Jakobsen cave was Finnish knowledge carried across the Atlantic, across Ohio, across Illinois, across Nebraska, carried for 20 years in a woman's hands until the February that required it finally arrived. Tell me about yours. I read every comment. The Jakobsen land, filed as the Leinonen Jakobsen claim in the spring of 1860, was productive farming land for 53 years. The cave at its center, the cave everyone called the Jakobsen cave, and then the Leinonen cave, and then simply the Warm Cave, was the cave that Astrid Leinonen had made into something else in the autumn of 1859. She built the stone-walled front room in the spring of 1860, with Berit Thorvaldsen's help and the Thorvaldsen children's assistance carrying stones, and it was finished before the second winter, and it was warmer than the cave alone, because the stone walls extended the Kiowa system's reach, and the south-facing window she had fitted with glass from the Red Cloud hardware admitted the winter sun to the north interior wall, and the north interior wall absorbed it, the way the Kiowa stones absorbed the fire. The ventilation system she had cut into the limestone in September 1859 was still functioning in 1912. The natural crack widened to 4 inches, carrying the cooking smoke and the candle smoke, and later the kerosene lamp smoke up through the limestone and out to the bluff face above. The same air management that had kept Lars Jakobsen's cave from being habitable, now making the Leinonen cave home. Eino Leinonen came from Michigan in May of 1860, with his wife Kaisa, who was also Finnish from Hemi province, who pressed her hands to the Kiowa stones on the first day she arrived and spoke to Astrid in Finnish for 2 hours about the specific quartzite formations of the Republican River bluffs and the correct way to fire a Kiowas in dry Nebraska air versus the humid air of the Upper Peninsula. Kaisa taught the Kiowa system to Berit Thorvaldsen and to the Mäkinen family from the Loop River drainage and to 3 other Finnish families who came through the Republican River Valley in the 1860s, asking about the Warm Cave they had heard about from someone who had heard about it from someone who had been there. Marta Thorvaldsen, who had been carried into the cave in her father's arms at -25 degrees in the blizzard of January 1860 with white lips and no movement, grew up to be a schoolteacher in Red Cloud. She was present at the 40th anniversary of the blizzard in January 1900, at a gathering in Red Cloud that the local newspaper reported with a story whose headline she saved in her papers and whose substance she had known since she was 26 months old and had felt the Kiowa's warmth come back into her hands as she lay against her mother's chest on the cave floor of a stone room that a Finnish widow had built from nothing in a cave where a Swedish man had died. She kept the newspaper clipping folded in her Bible. On the back of the clipping, in her own hand, she had written, "She held me toward the warm stones. I did not know, until I was old enough to know what had happened, that I should have died that night. She held me toward the warm stones, and the stones gave back what the fire had put into them, and I lived." The Kua stones that Astrid Leinonen had collected from the Republican River Bluff base in October of 1859 were in the cave for 30 years before the Leinonen family replaced them with a larger stone mass to heat the expanded front room. The original stones were moved to the corner of the cave where they had been stacked waiting to be used, and they were still there in 1912, in the corner of the original cave room, dense and dark, holding nothing now but memory. They were, for anyone who pressed a hand to them in the right season, still slightly warm from the fires of 50 years ago, the long residual heat of quartzite that had been properly fired and properly used and never fully let go of what it had been given. The hill held. The stone held, the knowledge held, because knowledge that keeps people alive has a way of traveling from hand to hand, generation to generation, across oceans and territories and winters that tried to stop it. Astrid Leinonen had known what to do. She had been taught.